Hello, Alien here, and in this video we're going to take a look at MeshCentral running behind a NGINX reverse proxy. So reverse proxies are a basic foundation of internet infrastructure at this point, and they're broadly used all over the place. And it's important that MeshCentral work nicely with them. And you'll see that it's because we want to make it easier to host, and we also want to lower the hosting cost of running MeshCentral. So let's take a look at how this works. So I'm going to start by taking a look at why we want to use MeshCentral behind a reverse proxy. So for example, you have a reverse proxy at the center of this picture here, and you may have a single public IP address. So this could be, from your cloud provider or from a small office, a business line, or so on. And you have multiple servers running in the back. So you have MeshCentral, but you could have HTTP servers, web servers, file servers, various, Docker containers, and so on. And so normally, in the old days, you would have a separate IP address for each of these different services in the back. And maybe you have all of this running on a single computer. Maybe it's different computers, but oftentimes you have a single computer that runs, for example, Docker, and you have all these services on the right and the reverse proxy. So what you do is you connect the reverse proxy to in such a way that it receives all the requests that are coming from the public internet, and then it will take those requests and forward them to the right service in the back. Now, how do you distinguish which connection goes to which service in the back? And especially since all these services will bind on port 443, or they want connections from HTTPS or HTTPs, or they're all on port 80 or 443. Well, what you do is you take your DNS server and you point multiple domain names to the same IP address. And what happens is that depending on which domain name you type, they're all going to resolve to the same IP address, but when the request is made from the browser to the reverse proxy, the browser will indicate what domain name it's intended this request to be for, and the reverse proxy will forward the request to the right place. Now, in addition, the reverse proxy can take care of TLS also. So the reverse proxy may have one or multiple TLS certificates. When a connection arrives on port 443, the SNI or TLS server name indication will indicate what domain name this request is for. The reverse proxy will present the right certificate, or if you have a single certificate with all these domain names, then it will present that certificate. The connection will complete, and then a non-TLS connection will be forwarded to the back. So that's roughly how this works. The main reason we do this is because we want to have a single public IP address sharing multiple services, and we want to lower our hosting costs by making it so that lots of different services can run on the same computer. So essentially, in this configuration, MeshCentral is basically free or almost free because you're just leveraging your existing infrastructure and adding one more container in the back of your on your server. So that's how it works. Now, let's take a look at just the relationship between NGINX, or any reverse proxy for that matter, and MeshCentral. So browsers will connect, and they'll connect on port 443. Mesh agents will also connect on port 443, and usually you'll have an NGINX certificate that is presented to both of these. Now, in addition, you have AMT that's connected on a different port, and it will have its own certificate, so we'll not worry about this right now. Now, when the mesh agent connects to NGINX, it will see this certificate that the NGINX provides, and it will then be forwarded over to MeshCentral, and MeshCentral will see this connection from this agent. It will prove that it's the right server by using the agent certificate that it has, but then it needs to know what certificate the agent saw and if that's legitimate. So obviously, NGINX here is acting like a man in the middle for the connection. So the MeshCentral server wants to make sure that the connection hit the right man in the middle, right? If there was some other actor further to the right here that was man in the middle in the connection, we don't want to accept it. We only want to accept the agent connection if the agent saw this certificate from NGINX, not some other one. So what we do is we're going to have MeshCentral query NGINX and say, please tell me what certificate you have, what certificate you're presenting to the agents, and then once it queries that, it will use that to do the verification. So I hope that makes sense. And what we're going to do is do a real demonstration now. And the first thing I'm going to do is start with my same trusty server that I have and I use on all the videos. This is my developer server. So right now it's set up without NGINX. It's just set up straight with port 443 and port 80 as you would normally. And you see it works. I can go on the machine, connect, it works perfectly. Okay, so now what I want to do is put NGINX in front of this server. So two things I'm going to do. First, I'm going to have a NGINX configuration file. And so we'll take a look at this. Now the configuration file, I suggest you just get one from the documentation of MeshCentral. You go in the user's guide. But basically what we're going to do is we're going to have NGINX listen to port 80, and then it's going to present a server name and forward that server name to the address in the back. In this case, we're going to pass it to IPv6 loopback port 800. And so instead of 80, we're going to be on 800. And then the server here on 443 is going to use this certificate that we have. In this case, it's a DSA certificate for this name. And then we're going to proxy or forward the connections to port 4430 on IPv6. And we're also going to allow WebSocket connections to also traverse. And then lastly, these extra headers will be added to the NGINX connection towards MeshCentral. And these extra headers will indicate what the real IP address of the agent or the user is. So if I'm going back to if I go back to the diagram here, for example, this one, well, these actors on the right have a certain IP address. When they connect, if we don't add the right headers here, what happens is that MeshCentral will think that all the connections are coming from NGINX. So it will take the IP address of NGINX here, which is like your local machine IP address, and say, well, all the connections are coming from here. But what you want in the log files, in the data files, and everywhere, what you want is to actually use the real IP address of the actors on the right. So what you have to do is tell NGINX to take the IP address of, for example, this browser and add it to the connection that is then forwarded to MeshCentral. So that is those extra headers right here. Now, another thing we're going to do in a minute is that we're going to tell MeshCentral that if it sees these extra headers from the IP address of NGINX, then trust those headers. Because obviously, if somebody else on the internet adds those headers and forwards them over to MeshCentral, we want to ignore them because they don't contain trusted values. But if the connection comes from NGINX and those headers are present, then we need to accept those. Okay, so this is our NGINX configuration. I have extra stuff on the bottom here, but that's not needed. You'll have an entry for usually port 443 and an entry for port 80 that forwards it to MeshCentral. Okay, then the configuration of MeshCentral will be a little different. First of all, MeshCentral will now run on 4430 and 800 instead of 443 and 80. And so that's because, obviously I'm going to be running NGINX and MeshCentral on the same machine in this case. So I need to put them on a different port. But there's this command here, alias port, that says that even though the MeshCentral server is running on 4430, pretend like you're running on 443. And so for the purpose of indicating where agents should connect, indicating where users, browsers should connect, providing links over on the internet or stuff like that, you need to pretend like you're on 443, which makes sense because any connection that will come on 443 will then be routed to MeshCentral. Another thing here is this TLS offload. This says to MeshCentral, don't do TLS on port 4430 because NGINX will be doing TLS for you, decrypting all the connections, all the traffic, and then sending you non-encrypted traffic to port 4430. So TLS offload here. Now, if you just put TLS offload true, that it will do that. But if you put an IP address, for example, 127.0.0.1 or IPv6 loopback or something like that, then what this says is if there's extra headers in those connections coming in, trust them. So you would usually put the internal IP address of NGINX as this on this field here. Now, same for the MPS port. This is for Intel AMT. If you're not using the MPS port, you can just put 0 here, and that will neutralize it. But this is the port that AMT will connect to if you have that. And the same as the TLS port that we have an alias for, here we're going to have an alias for the MPS port. So even though I'm listening on this port, pretend like I'm actually on 4433. And then we're going to say TLS offload true because we don't want to do TLS on that port. The reverse proxy will do that for me. Okay, so that's pretty good. I have what I need here, except for one thing. If I go down to the domain section of the configuration, there's something called CertURL. Now, what you have to do is present here or give MeshCentral a URI where to retrieve the certificate that the agents will see when they connect. So if I go back to the PowerPoint slide, I need to provide a URI to NGINX so that this certificate here can be picked up by MeshCentral. And MeshCentral will use the certificate it receives on that URI as a trusted certificate so that when it negotiates connections with the agents, it's okay. So here I'm going to put 127.0.0.1, and that will connect. That will retrieve the certificate. Now you'll note another thing is I have two domains. So I have the main domain is going to be central.mesh.meshcentral.com in my case, and then I have a second domain here called devtest, and it's called devbox.mesh.meshcentral.com. So I have two domains. I have two URIs, and we'll see what happens here when I run the server. Okay, so I'm going to stop the server, and I'm going to clear the box, and I'm going to restart it. But now I'm going to restart MeshCentral --config file, and I'm going to use the NGINX configuration file. So this config file is in the same MeshCentral data folder as the normal config.json, but I'm just telling it to use that config instead. So perfect. So it's running. And you'll notice like a few things here. It says it's running on port 44330, alias port 4433. So as we saw in the configuration, you're actually listening to this one, but pretend like you're listening on that one. And same for the HTTP server. So I'm sorry, this is the 443 for the HTTPS, but it says HTTP here because it's not doing HTTPS, it's not doing TLS. So that's why it says HTTP, and same for the AMT server. It will not do TLS here. Okay, so I'm running this, and of course, all my agents on all my machines that I have in my house here, they will try to connect to port 443. Right now, NGINX is not running, so all the agents are failing when they connect. Also, MeshCentral tried to retrieve the TLS certificate to NGINX for both host names, for both my domains, but it was unsuccessful. It couldn't do that. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run NGINX. And here I just have a Windows version of NGINX. I'm going to run it from the command line. Normally you would install it as a background service and so on, but just for this demonstration, I'm just going to run it from the command line. And I'm going to just type NGINX. Now, before I hit enter here, what's going to happen is as soon as I run this, NGINX is going to bind to port 80 and 443. It's going to start receiving connections and forward those connections to MeshCentral. Now, what's going to happen with the first connection that goes through from an agent is that MeshCentral is going to say, wait a minute, this agent connection was received, but it did not see a certificate that I trust. So it sees this certificate here, but this certificate is not a certificate that's known by MeshCentral. But as soon as that connection arrives to MeshCentral, MeshCentral is going to try again to load the certificate off of the reverse proxy. And as soon as it does that, it's going to load the certificate, get the certificate hash, make sure everything's okay, and then it's going to start accepting all the connections that the reverse proxy sends to it. So let's do it. Let's just hit enter here and run it. So now NGINX is running, and immediately you saw the first agent connect, and the agent said, bad certificate. Whoops, this is not the certificate, so I'm holding the connection. And then the agent reported, that it saw a certificate with this hash. So then immediately what happened is MeshCentral turns around, tries again to connect to NGINX to get a new certificate, and it gets the certificate with this hash. Now, it just so happens that the certificate it gets from NGINX matches the one that the agent has seen, and so everything is okay. So I'm going to hit refresh here, and my browser is now seeing a certificate that it never saw before. It's the certificate of NGINX, and I'm using self-signed certs here, not trusted, let's encrypt or anything. So I'm just going to accept, and you'll see here, I see the browser, I see the web page. I'm going to log in. I'm going to use my FIDO key to log in two-factor, and here we go. So there's a bunch of agents connected, and I can click and connect, and it all works. Okay, and also if you look in the let's see, the event log, you'll notice that it says, for example, ended remote session from, this IP address to this IP address and so on. And you'll notice that these IP addresses, obviously right now I'm on my local network, so they're all, internal IP addresses. But if you set up everything correctly, these IP addresses should be correct. They should be the actual IP address of the agent and the browser that's connecting from outside. And so if these are correct, that means that you've put the right headers inside NGINX. So you've added the right headers right here. And also in the configuration, you've put TLS offload and you've put the right IP address of NGINX. So if those two things are done correctly, you will see the real IP addresses show up here. So I think that's pretty much it. Otherwise, now what you can do is obviously split your public IP address among multiple services in the back. MeshCentral should just work perfectly normally as before. In fact, now MeshCentral is not doing TLS, so it's actually slightly more efficient for MeshCentral. It has a little bit less work it needs to do. And then you can independently on NGINX, firewall the connections or ban stuff or monitor the connections on NGINX while MeshCentral does handle all the traffic and so on. Another thing that's interesting is that if NGINX were to ever change its certificate to a new one, Well, for example, NGINX is using Let's Encrypt or something like that, and it suddenly renews that certificate to a new one. Well, the next connection to come in will cause this agent batch certificate to be triggered, and it will automatically cause MeshCentral to try to reload the certificates again from NGINX. Now, there's a limit to how frequently MeshCentral will do this, but the interesting part is that if NGINX occasionally rotates its certificate, it will not cause a service disruption to MeshCentral. In any case, I hope this was useful. Obviously, understanding how to run MeshCentral using a reverse proxy is super important. This is basic internet infrastructure. It allows you to lower cost, put multiple services alongside MeshCentral, and MeshCentral will work perfectly fine with co-located with possibly tens or hundreds of other services on your own machine. Hope that was useful. Thank you very much.